Welcome back, y'all, to the Triple P Trigger Warning Network on YouTube. I'm Mike, and today we're going to talk about today's date, October 13th. So, about 700 years ago, Friday, October 13th, 1307, the Knights Templars were sacked, rounded up, arrested by the corrupt King of France, King Philip. King Philip arrested the Knights Templars because he was deep in debt, mostly to them. He owed them money, and the Knights Templars at the time were basically like the world's first banking organization because they were the most powerful military unit in the world with the best equipment and the best castles. Kings, queens, and rich noblemen would uh, ask to put their riches and their wealth held in the Knights Templars castles so that nobody could steal from them. So what King Philip did was get the Pope to convinced the Pope that Uh, the Knights Templars should be declared heretics because of their secret rituals. And on Friday the 13th, which is a day that most people believe is unlucky because it started back then when the Knights Templars were rounded up, tortured, imprisoned, and killed. Um, but the Knights Templars, they were very, very smart. They kind of knew something like this would happen. So what they did was the days or the weeks and months leading up to October 13th, they had already amassed most of their wealth that was held in their castles in France and had them on boats. So by the time they all started getting arrested, they were able to send a message to the ships on the French coastline to sail away so that the king's troops were not able to confiscate all of their riches. The Knights Templars, they were tasked with protecting uh, Christian pilgrims um, during the Crusades. They were tasked with fighting the enemy during the Crusades, and they were also tasked with, while they were in the Middle East, in the Holy Land, to search for ancient religious artifacts and relics, including uh, the shroud that was covered Jesus' body after he was crucified, um, the Holy Grail, which was the last cup that Jesus drank from the night before he was crucified. And also, rumor has it that they were also tasked with finding ancient artifacts like pieces of Noah's Ark or even the lost Ark of the Covenant that the Israelites used to have. Now, the lost Ark of the Covenant supposedly is one of the most powerful items ever to exist in the world. Um, it was a box that had to be carried by at least two people, and it contained the tablets of the Ten Commandments that were passed down to Moses by God. Now, supposedly, any army that carried the ark was invincible. So, needless to say, you know, that makes sense why the Knights Templars would want to find something like that, locate it, and then stash it away. So the Knights Templars decided what was left of them across Europe decided to go underground because they were basically destroyed. By 1312, the Pope, the King of France, had convinced the Pope to completely disband the Knights Templars. So their main base of operation, they had castles all over Europe, but their basically their headquarters became in Scotland because that was the most secure place that they could be. And they decided to go underground, but keep their organization secret. So they knew that they had to continue their organization and continue their influence. So they became um, stonemasons and laborers, and that's where the name Freemasons came from. Fast forward to the colonies and the start of United States of America. Um, Freemasons were basically members. They had members high positions of power. Um, most of our founding fathers were Freemasons. So they would take secret oaths behind closed doors And whatever knowledge was passed on from the Knights Templars and the previous Masons, they were sworn and bound to keep that information secret. There are, throughout the years, there have been several influential politicians, including U.S. presidents, that have been Freemasons. And of course, as you know, the organization still exists today. So this book, Secret Societies, Knights Templars to Skull and Bones, I'm going to read you some of this because this stuff is very interesting. Now, two of the most prominent Skull and Bones were two former U.S. presidents, George Herbert Walker Bush and George W. Bush. On page 304 of this book, it says, "The story of the night that George W. Bush was tapped for entry in the Skull and Bones is told in Bill Minutaglio's first son. George was not sure he wanted the rigor of meeting with fellow bonesmen 2 nights a week. He was already born into wealth, and thanks to his father, into power. George told a fellow classmate that he would rather join Gin and Tonic instead of the Skull and Bones. His father, George Sr., probably anticipating his son's doubt, knocked on his door at 8 o'clock and said, 'George, it's time for you to do the right thing and become a good man.' So basically, W, he didn't really have a choice. His old man, former CIA director, former World War II hero, he was shot. That he was a pilot shot down in the Pacific, and he barely survived. He was rescued by a submarine while he's out there floating in the Pacific. This guy, was like, "Hey, look, you ain't got a choice. This is your this is your duty." So, you know, W, he just wanted to party all the time, but he's like he had to suck it up. So, make a long story short, Skull and Bones is one of those secret organizations. Um, I think their membership is only they have no more than 15 new members each year, and they all obviously are all rich elites, uh, and Yale students. So this organization, you know, they they try to do influential things. Like for instance, and they're they're either deep into politics, like political figures, politicians, judges, governors, people in positions of power, and they do things behind the scenes to influence world events. One example, January 2003. Oh, I read a Time magazine talking about January 2003, right? January 2003, 2 months before the war, 2 months before America invaded Iraq and the second Iraq war started, George Sr. Bush, now he's retired, right? He's former president. He was still working for one of these big oil companies. I forgot the name. But 2 months before the war started in January, George flew to Saudi Arabia and was talking to oil sheiks and working out backdoor deals. Now, the press was asked the oil company, they're like, "Hey, is he there on official business?" The oil company's like, "No, he's not. He is a member of our board, but he's not there on official business." Are you freaking serious? Come on. 2 months before his son sends gives the order to invade Iraq, he's over there talking to the oil sheiks. Come on, you know what's going on. They're doing stuff. They're making deals behind the door, behind the scenes. So that's another example of what these secret societies are capable of doing. They're in positions of power. You know what I'm saying? Because everybody knows that the world is not really run by the politicians. The world is run by the banks and the corporations. And organizations like Skull and Bones, the Freemasons, they have members in high positions of power in these banks, these corporations, and also in politics so that they can maneuver wealth. And sometimes they will create um, events, tragic, even large tragic events to, you know, to further their goal. And in this book, they cite some of those things. Uh, so when it comes to the Bush connection, all right. The amount of now this is uh back in the 80s, right? This is when the CIA started um getting involved in Afghanistan when the Russians were at war with Afghanistan. Says the amount of heroin addicts, which dropped from 500,000 to 200,000 in the years of Vietnam, because if you remember Vietnam, um, the CIA was to fund their operations. Um, they were like heavy involved in the drug trade, and they were using the war in Vietnam as a cover. So the heroin addicts rose from 500,000, or they fell from 500,000 to about 200,000 in the years after Vietnam because things started dying down. But then the heroin addicts rose sharply after America, through the CIA, lent assistance to Afghanistan. The CIA backing of the opium growers in Afghanistan was no surprise. Even the President's Strategic Council on Drug Abuse was frustrated enough by the CIA's silence on the issue that it pointed out in the New York Times editorial that drug use would rise just as it did with the CIA adventures in Laos during the Vietnam War. The prediction was correct as the addict census grew to 450,000 after it was down to 200,000, grew back up to almost half a million heroin deaths, and in New York, and the heroin deaths in New York City rose to 77%. So this book goes on to state the creative form of the Skull and Bones constructive chaos had the government spending billions to fight war on drugs and billions more to jail users, while making the world safe for drug lords from the Afghan hills to the Golden Triangle of the Southeast Asia and the Honduran coast. The Bush tradition in the Skull and Bones began with George's father, Prescott, who was a Bones man and served in Army intelligence. The Bush family members were close to the Rockefellers and Harrimans and served on numerous corporation boards. So, you know, that's a lot of corruption right there. Now, suffice it to say, you know, do they control world events? Do they have a good reason for it? Because, it's for the greater good? I don't know. But what I can tell you is they're making a lot of money off of it. You know, if you're in that position of power, that's what happens, when you're greedy. You just can't help yourself. So that's how it is. So October 13th is a day that will live in infamy. You know, just goes to show, you know, the rights, the privileges, the benefits, the freedom, and the relative peace that we enjoy in the 48 states, or the 50 states of America, in this land that we're here. It ain't free, and the people in positions of power, they feel justified in doing things that some might feel is horrible, like giving weapons to Israel, or, you know, um, getting involved in Iran Contra, where you're selling weapons to Iranians to fund uh, fighting wars against communists in South and Central America. So, you know, it's not something that I would want to get involved in, but it's definitely something that I want to read about. So, another thing I want to tell you about on this channel, go over to my shorts and you will see that evidence of Area 51 that I was telling you about. That's actually the actual video that I took 3 years ago. And then what I want you to do is go to Google Maps on your phone, type in Groom Lake, Nevada, then select the satellite image of Groom Lake, Nevada, and compare what you see in that video in my short on this channel to the supposedly satellite footage, the current satellite footage on Google Maps. It won't match up. All right, and that's proof that Area 51 is still an ultra top secret military facility that even presidents don't have access to. So, you know, that's how it is, man. You gotta keep your eyes open because it was just by chance that I saw it. You know, most of the people on the plane were asleep. They had their windows closed. They were sleeping. But me being inquisitive as I was, and like, I like looking out the window anyway, looking at, the beautiful earth. There was this little, just like when you're walking down the street on a sunny day, you see this like little pebble that just kind of like glimmers in your eye. That's basically what I saw. And I was like, hmm, we got to be in Nevada by now. And the pilot just said we're about a half hour from arrival time. I know where Area 51 is. It's like 90 miles north of Las Vegas or something, because all the History Channel shows I watch. So I pulled out my cell phone and zoomed in. Now, the interesting thing about that video is, yeah, it takes a couple minutes for me to actually zoom into Area 51 and show you the infrastructure that they have. But if you look at the beginning of the video, to the bottom left corner of your screen, you're going to see this massive infrastructure, right? That I believe actually more than likely is what Bob Lazar called his S4. Now, Bob Lazar, for y'all don't know, he's the guy that first broke the news in 1989 about Area 51. And he claimed that he worked at Area S4, which was north of Area 51. And it was, S4 was more secure than Area 51. So, like, if you had clearance to work at Area 51, which is, pretty fucking top secret, he said the guys that had clearance at Area 51 didn't have clearance at S4. Bob Lazar said he never actually saw any, extraterrestrial life forms or bodies. He saw pictures of them, but his main purpose, why they hired him, was to reverse engineer technology of crashed spaceships that crashed, like in Roswell, New Mexico stuff. So if you read my book that I wrote called The Answer, is Spirituality, Paranormal, and Science All Connected. In that book, I published pictures and sketches that Bob Lazar made on the anti-gravitational technology that these spacecraft have. And they're powered by what Bob Lazar claimed is an element called unobtainium element 115. Now, skeptics, when Bob Lazar first came out there, skeptics said, hey, look, he's just making this up, because if it was true, he'd be winning a Nobel Peace Prize by now. But the reason why the mainstream community could not accept that is because of ultra top secret shadowy elements in our government suppressing it. But eventually the truth comes out, because in 2004, the scientific community, I think there was some lab in England, they officially put unobtainium on the periodic table. Element 15 did actually exist. And Bob Lazar says that element 15 is an element that these anti-gravitational engines use to produce kind of sort of like a quantum fuel, and it propels the spacecraft in kind of sort of like a anti-gravitational warp bubble. So check out my book, check out the video, post comments, you know what I'm saying? Find this book, read it. It's got a lot of dirty secrets in it. Yeah, I love this country. You know what I'm saying? I was willing to die for this country. I still am. I'm a retired. I'm a veteran. I'm a disabled veteran, so I can't fight no more. But you know what? Just because a country has a bunch of secrets, some of which are dirty, don't mean that we still can't love it. So until next time, peace and stay up.